Today's video is part 2 of chapter 5. So we're going to be talking more about instrumental conditioning, or as I will often call it, operant conditioning. So in the last video, we talked about basically the history of instrumental conditioning, some of the early investigations, and how that's led into what we use today. So our next part is going to be today's topic, which is the actual procedures that are involved in instrumental conditioning. And then we're probably going to start covering some of the fundamental elements that are involved in those procedures. And then we'll wrap up the whole topic in the third part, where we'll finish off the fundamental elements next time. But for today, let's start with our instrumental conditioning procedures. Now, most of the terminology that we're going to be talking about should be probably twice over review and refresher for you guys. You would have heard these terms back in 104, and then again in 282, and possibly in other courses as well. So the first thing we want to define are two different kinds of stimuli. We can have an appetitive stimulus, which is something that is pleasant or satisfying. I use the idea that it has the same root as appetite, as something that you might want to eat, so it's something good. That's how I remember it. We can also have an aversive stimulus, which is the opposite. So an aversive stimulus is something unpleasant or annoying. And you can have a situation where these stimuli can be either turned on or turned off. So our instrumental responses, the behavior that we're doing, can result in either the delivery of either an appetitive or aversive stimulus, or the removal of, or the turning off of, an appetitive or aversive stimulus. And that dichotomy of sort of good or bad stimuli that are either added or removed is how we end up with the next set of definitions that we want to talk about, which are the different kinds of procedures. So positive and negative, reinforcement, and punishment. Now, the textbook presents a table kind of like this, where we list all four of our options together, and we talk about the procedure's name, the contingency between our response and our outcome, and the result to the behavior in the end. But I actually find it easier to think of these terms this way, which is asking ourselves, are we adding or removing a stimulus? If we're adding a stimulus, it's going to be positive. If we're removing a stimulus, it's going to be negative. And then we can ask ourselves, does the behavior increase or decrease? If the behavior increases, it's going to be reinforcement. And if the behavior decreases, it's going to be punishment. And so that way, just by looking at whether we're adding or removing a stimulus and whether the behavior increases or decreases, we can differentiate between positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Now, that might not work for everyone. I just like to point out this as an alternative to just memorizing all four kinds of procedures. If you already know these, or if you can memorize these just fine, then you are more than welcome to do so. My brain just doesn't really work that way. But we can look at our four options for positive reinforcement from what I just said. Because it's positive, we're adding a stimulus. And because it's reinforcement, the behavior is going to increase. So our behavioral response, the action that the animal produces, is going to lead to an appetitive stimulus being presented. So you do the response and something good is added. And as a result, we're going to see an increase in response rate. That behavior, that response, is going to become more likely to occur. We see that increase in the behavior because something good was added. For negative reinforcement, our behavioral response will eliminate or prevent some aversive stimulus, or it's going to remove something bad. And as a result, we're going to see an increase in the likelihood of that response being produced. So because we are taking away a stimulus, that's the negative part, and it's leading to an increase in the likelihood of that behavior occurring, it's reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is we remove something bad to increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring. And continuing on, we can look at positive punishment. Positive meaning that we're adding a stimulus. Punishment meaning that it's going to lead to a decrease in the behavior. So your behavioral response will result in the delivery of an aversive stimulus. That behavior, that response, will produce something bad. Something bad is added, and we see a decrease in the likelihood of that response being produced in the future. And then for negative punishment, it's negative, so we're removing a stimulus. Punishment, we're trying to decrease the response rate. So our behavioral response eliminates or prevents an appetitive stimulus. So doing that behavior will lead to something good being taken away. And so as a result, we see that that behavior, that response is a lot less likely to occur in the future. Our response rate will decrease. So those are our 4 options. It would be a very good idea to know the difference between these. And if you were, say, presented with a scenario, would you be able to tell the difference between positive and negative reinforcement and punishment? Could you identify them if I described a scenario for you? And so we have this information presented just one more time to make sure that you know it. I'm going to go over it very, very quickly because we just did all this. Positive reinforcement, we're adding something appetitive to increase our response rate, to increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring. So here we're giving a dolphin a treat, maybe to reinforce a particular behavior. So we're teaching them a trick, and they did the trick, so we're going to give them food, and it's going to make them more likely to do that trick in the future. For positive punishment, we're adding something aversive or bad to decrease a response rate. So we're adding something bad to make sure that that behavior isn't done in the future. So scolding a child would be an example of positive punishment. If your parents yelled at you, or if you've ever been spanked, that's positive punishment. And for the most part, positive punishment is usually discouraged. It's very frowned upon to be used. You're usually a lot better off to use something like negative punishment. But there are cases where positive punishment is either the best solution or maybe even the only solution. So sometimes it does still crop up. It's just usually preferred to use a different kind of punishment just to avoid having to deliver an aversive stimulus. For negative reinforcement, we're removing something aversive to increase our response rate. And these are some interesting ones to try and wrap your head around, but there's the example of, say, traffic. If you usually get stuck in traffic every morning on your drive to work, maybe you try a new behavior, a new response, and maybe you leave half an hour early. And as a result, there's no traffic. That aversive stimulus of getting stuck in a traffic jam is gone. And so maybe now you're more likely to leave the house early because if you leave early, you don't have to deal with traffic. This same concept can be applied with sunglasses or even umbrellas, where by using those devices, you're able to avoid something aversive, like the sun being too bright or you getting soaked with rain. So our negative reinforcement is you remove something bad, and that removal makes you more likely to do the behavior again in the future. And then for our last one, this is negative punishment, which the textbook also calls omission training, and it also calls differential reinforcement of other behaviors, but we'll come back to that specific term in just a minute. For now, we'll stick to negative punishment or omission training. And this is the removal of something appetitive or good to decrease the response rate. The classic example of this is a child getting put on timeout. So if you do a bad behavior, maybe you hit your sibling, or maybe you speak disrespectfully to your parents, you do some kind of response or behavior that's bad, then your parents can remove something like your freedom to run around and wreak havoc by putting you on timeout. So you've lost that freedom. So you've lost or removed that appetitive stimulus. And as a result, hopefully you're going to be less likely to do that bad behavior in the future. Some other examples of this might be if you misbehave, you're not allowed to go out and play with your friends later. Or maybe something we can relate a little bit more to nowadays, if you are somebody who drives. The threat of a suspended driver's license, losing that freedom and privilege to drive, could be a consequence of driving illegally. Maybe you're driving while impaired, or maybe you're just really bad at following the rules of the road. Those bad behaviors can result in the removal of something good, your ability to drive. And hopefully that kind of a consequence will result in a decrease in bad driving behaviors in the future. And so, as I said just a couple of slides back, this is the more desirable form of punishment in most scenarios. So if you can use negative punishment, it's preferred over positive punishment, just because you're removing something appetitive, you're not having to introduce something aversive. All right. And so for the next two slides, these are more for you guys to test yourselves. I can have you pause the slide here and sort of think through these options, and then the next slide has the answer. So if we're looking at studying versus skipping class and what's the consequence, can you identify the procedure and our result or the outcome? And so I will swap to the next slide. And so we have positive reinforcement leading to an increase in behavior, negative reinforcement, also an increase in behavior, positive punishment and negative punishment, both leading to a decrease in behavior. And there are tons and tons of examples of positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So if you want to work on testing yourself and your ability to tell the difference between these, there are example questions in the textbook, and this is a topic that is taught in all sorts of different psychology classes, so a good trick is actually to Google examples of positive punishment or examples of positive reinforcement and see what comes up, because there are lots and lots of questions out there. I just find that some people like extra practice problems for these kinds of topics just to make sure that they can tell the difference. All right. So this slide here is where we can start talking about differential reinforcement of other behaviors, which I had mentioned as another way of talking about negative punishment or omission training. And basically what I mean by that is that we're seeing with negative punishment or omission training that you are removing something good when they do the behavior. So the assumption would be that that good thing would have been present if they had done any behavior other than the one that they did. So they did a bad thing and they lost their privilege to do whatever it was that they were doing. But if they hadn't done the bad behavior, if the child hadn't hit their sibling, then they would have been able to do that good or appetitive stimulus thing, like playing with their toys. So when we talk about differential reinforcement of other behaviors, we're basically saying that you get no reinforcement, you don't get that appetitive stimulus if you do that one behavior that we don't want you to do, but you can get that appetitive stimulus, that reinforcement, if you do some other behavior other than the one that we're trying to eliminate. Now, this technique is often talked about or used in situations where you want to stop some kind of bad behavior, whether it be self-injuring behavior that's often seen with individuals with, say, learning disabilities, or even behavioral problems in children. What we do find often is, especially with children, if you think of parents who yell at their kids or who have to scold them constantly, we can think of that as actually being a reinforcing act. By scolding the children, they might actually be giving them attention, which the children might view as a good thing. And so they might act out to get that attention. So instead of what the parents think is going on, which is positive punishment, where the parents think that they should be decreasing the bad behavior, what might actually be happening is some kind of reinforcement, positive reinforcement, because the children are actually viewing that scolding as attention, as something that's good and desirable. We can end up using this process of differential reinforcement of other behaviors to try and get away from that accidental or unintentional reinforcement of bad behaviors. So if you have a child who shouts for attention, instead of giving them attention, maybe you ignore them. You give them no attention. So we're using negative punishment here, where you are not giving them that appetitive stimulus that they want. You're not giving them attention when they do that behavior. Instead, what you should do is give them attention when they're not engaging in that behavior. So if your child is yelling for attention and you don't give it to them, you wait until they stop yelling. And as soon as they stop yelling, then you can give them attention. So you are differentially reinforcing behaviors by reinforcing anything other than yelling. So as soon as they stop yelling, you can give them that reinforcement, you can give them that attention, and it should make them more likely to do the behaviors that are not yelling. And we can actually see a graph here from a study that was looking at an individual who engaged in self-injurious behavior. Basically, she would injure herself in order to get attention. And so on this graph here, we're looking at responses per minute, basically how many times are they injuring themselves during the session, and then across all of the sessions. So this is our time variable here. And in the sort of darker gray parts that are kind of hard to see, but the parts that have higher scores are periods when this individual was engaging in that self-injurious behavior. So we have higher scores of this injurious behavior, and so during these periods, they would get no attention. And then what happens here in this sort of lighter space that's been blocked off, they stop engaging in that self-injurious behavior, and our trainer or whoever's performing this experiment would then provide reinforcement for other behaviors. Basically, when they do anything other than that self-injurious behavior. And during those periods when they're receiving that reinforcement, we see this dramatic drop-off of that self-harming behavior. Then when they go back to self-harming behavior, we ignore them again, and then when they sort of reduce that behavior, then they can get attention again. And over time, we'll actually see a drop-off in the amount of self-injurious behavior that they perform. So at the beginning, we had this really long period of that injurious behavior. Then in the next couple of sessions, it's a lot less. And over time, we see that drop off, and there aren't as many of these large bursts of self-harming behavior. And this can be very effective in getting rid of unwanted behaviors, especially those that can harm the individual doing them. All right. So that was a crash course in our instrumental conditioning procedures. As promised at the beginning, I want to start talking about some of the fundamental elements involved in instrumental conditioning. And we're going to build on these elements as time goes on, but because this chapter is sort of our foundations of instrumental conditioning, we're going to cover the basics so that we can build on them in later chapters. So let's start off with our 3 fundamental elements that are involved in instrumental conditioning. And these are our instrumental response, the outcome of the response, for example, our reinforcer. We can also talk about a punisher here, but the textbook tends to stick to reinforcers, at least for now. We'll talk about punishers and aversive stimuli and things like that in a later chapter. I think chapter 10 is when we start looking at aversive stimuli. So most of the stuff we're going to talk about from here on out is going to be focusing on positive and negative reinforcement. Just keep in mind that that's not going to be the whole picture. So that's our instrumental response, the behavior that we're performing, the outcome response, what happens as a result of what we're doing. So what do we get out of it? And the third thing that we want to consider is the relationship between our instrumental response and the outcome that we receive. Now, I'm not going to talk about all three of these in today's video. To break up the chapter nice and evenly, I'm probably only going to talk about the first two, but we'll see how our timing is doing. So let's start with this instrumental response. Now, it makes sense that the type of behavior, the type of response that we're trying to condition can actually affect how the whole instrumental conditioning procedure can proceed. But before we talk a little bit more about what types of responses do or do not condition well in particular circumstances, let's actually talk a little bit about a common misconception when it comes to instrumental responses. So when we've talked about the definition of instrumental conditioning, or sort of how these were founded, we talked about Thorndike and his idea of the stamping in of our SR association, which we will talk about just a little bit more in Chapter 7. We've also talked about Skinner and this idea of reinforcing or strengthening a behavior. Now, both of these scientists emphasize the fact that reinforcement is increasing the likelihood that some response will be repeated in the future. That's kind of the nature of instrumental conditioning. The problem that I want to draw some attention to here, and that the textbook focuses on fairly briefly, is that this way of talking about it suggests that instrumental conditioning is going to result in some kind of stereotyped behavior, where the responses that are produced are going to be very rigid and fixed and potentially very unchanging. And so what we're spending this slide, and actually the next possibly two slides as well, talking about is the fact that not all responses that are conditioned through instrumental conditioning are by nature very stereotyped. They're not rigid, they're not all fixed. We can, in fact, have instrumental conditioning that leads to variable responses, where we can see changing and fluid responses, quite unlike what we might assume if we took Thorndike and Skinner's definitions just at face value. Now, the textbook talks about an example where researchers were reinforcing participants, human participants, for producing different sized and shaped and locationed rectangles. So these human participants had to draw a rectangle, and they were awarded points if the rectangles were a different size, if they were a different shape, or if they were on a different position than any rectangle that they had drawn previously. And the textbook goes on to state that they did follow-up experiments where they could sort of differentiate whether it was the size, the shape, or the location that had to vary. And that's a really cool study. It's very, very interesting. However, I find that when talking about human behavior, maybe it's a little bit less impressive because humans can do so many really cool and complex things. So instead, let's talk about response variability and something that we might think of as a little bit simpler. Let's talk about it in pigeons. Now, if you've read through the rectangle example from the textbook, this experiment has the same basic setup. We're just doing it with pigeons. So pigeons in an operant chamber had to peck between two different keys a total of 8 times. So we don't specify what those keys are, and honestly, it doesn't really matter. To match our graph here, we might have one key that is horizontal stripe and one that is solid black. And they had to peck between that striped and black key a total of 8 times. And there's no restriction on the distribution of pecks between the two keys. However, they would only they would only receive reinforcement if that particular pattern of pecking between the left and right keys, between our horizontal striped and our black keys, hadn't been seen in the previous 50 trials. So basically, if on trial 1 they pecked the horizontal striped key 8 times, they would get food. But if on trial 2 they did it again, they wouldn't get food because that combination had already happened. If they then switched and pecked only black every time for 8 trials, then they would get food again, but if they repeated it, they wouldn't get food. So only novel patterns would be reinforced. And so at first you can peck all horizontal 8 times, then you can peck all black 8 times, but then you have to start mixing it up. Maybe you do 1 horizontal, 1 black, 1 horizontal, 1 black, back and forth until you hit 8. Somehow the pigeons had to mix it up and make new patterns to keep getting reinforced. So let's actually look at the data that's being presented over here. So we actually have, so our bars are talking about the first 5 trials and the last 5 trials. So before they had gone through lots of instrumental training and after lots of instrumental training. So the colors of the bars aren't actually related to what the keys looked like, but whatever, it doesn't matter. But what we do see is that we have sort of these before and after snapshots for 2 different groups. Our variability group, the group that would be reinforced for novel patterns, and then we'd have our control group. Now our control group could be either randomly reinforced, where they would receive food completely irrelevant of how many times they pecked the different keys, or they could be, like the human experiment from the textbook, they could be a yoked control group, which just means that this control group, birds in this group, would receive reinforcement whenever their paired bird from the experimental group received reinforcement. So if I grab my little pen tool over here, so we have our experimental group and our control group, which still see. So our experimental group might have 3 pigeons in it. I don't actually know how large the group was, but we have pigeon A, pigeon B, and pigeon C in our experimental group, and these would be matched or yoked to pigeons little a, little b, and little c in our control group. And so whenever pigeon big A would make a response that had not been seen before and they received reinforcement for that novel response, so they get food, then their partner, their yoked compatriot, would also receive reinforcement. And so that way we can directly compare sort of rate of reinforcement between the 2 groups without these guys receiving reinforcement that was contingent upon their behavior. So from the perspective of pigeon little a, their getting of food was completely unrelated to whatever behavior they were doing. It's effectively random for them. So that's how a yoked condition works. But there's a bunch of different ways you can do a control group, and it doesn't particularly reflect on the results we're seeing here. I just figured this was a... Oops, clicking on all sorts of wrong stuff here. It's just a good way to explain what a yoked control looks like while we're here. But that explanation out of the way, we see that the group that was reinforced for variability in their last trials shows more variability than the control group does in their last trials. And in fact, both groups have fairly similar amounts of variability in their responses at the beginning, but our control group actually shows less variability over time because they weren't being reinforced for variability. So we can actually start seeing more stereotyped behavior if we're not reinforcing variability. So if response variation is a requirement for reinforcement, like in our experimental group here, we can see an increase in variability. But in other situations, we will see that implied stereotyped behavior. So this isn't saying that behavior cannot be stereotyped when we go through our instrumental conditioning. We're just saying that it doesn't have to be stereotyped. We can reinforce for variability, and we can see variability. It's not as hard of a rule as what we might have inferred if we just took Skinner and Thorndike's definitions and ideas at face value. All right, the next thing that we want to consider about our response, our instrumental response, or the behavior that we are training, is the belongingness or relevance of that particular response. Now, this concept is actually going to sound familiar because we've already talked about it. Back in chapter 4, when we were looking at classical conditioning, we talked about how rats learned to associate tastes with sickness, but they had trouble associating taste with shock. If you remember back to that experiment with our bright, noisy, tasty water, where rats would be made to either feel sick afterwards or would receive a shock. And so things like taste belong with sickness, and things like audio-visual or external stimuli tend to belong with or match with pain. So we have this concept of belongingness influencing how easy it is for us to associate two ideas together. And we can see this exact same relationship with instrumental conditioning as well. So even Thorndike proposed this idea of belongingness being important when you're trying to condition a particular instrumental response. So Thorndike had his puzzle boxes, and he put cats inside the puzzle box. And we've talked about the standard version of the puzzle box, where the cats had to use different pawing behaviors to release latches or pull on strings in order to escape. But Thorndike did other variations on this particular setup. He tried to train cats to do other behaviors, things like scratching themselves or yawn, in order to be released from the puzzle box. But he found that over time, those behaviors didn't really develop. The cats would lift their leg to scratch themselves, but they would kind of stop. They would stall in the behavior. Or they might open their mouths as though they were yawning, but they wouldn't actually continue to yawn. And so Thorndike proposed that maybe the evolutionary history of an organism makes certain responses belong with certain reinforcers. And if certain responses do not belong with the particular reinforcer that's being used, then maybe they don't work. Maybe we can't learn to do that particular response. So with the example of cats not yawning to get let out of an enclosed space, in the wild, if a cat was trying to escape from somewhere, they'd be doing behaviors like scratching around, trying to find a way out. They wouldn't be sitting there calmly, relaxed, and yawning. And so that might be why it's harder for them to associate that behavior of yawning as the response that leads to them getting let out of the box. And even to this day, a lot of researchers have this idea that a behavior can't be reinforced by a reinforcer if it's not naturally linked to that reinforcer in the repertoire of that particular animal. So if that species doesn't associate that particular behavior with a particular reinforcer, then it's probably not going to be learned, the association won't learn, and they're not going to be able to do that response. And we have a really colorful example of an extreme of this occurring. And this is a fun anecdote, but also illustration of that idea of belongingness. So you might have already heard this story. This is one of my favorites when I talk about belongingness, and it comes up in our textbook as well. But this is Breland and Breland, which I believe are a husband and wife who did research together, and they have a paper called The Misbehavior of Organisms. And so they tell a story of they were trying to train a raccoon to participate in a car commercial. They, as a profession, had trained animals for circuses and zoos. They were great at behavioral manipulation. And so for this car commercial, they wanted to have a raccoon who would pick up a coin and deposit it into a piggy bank. Sounds fairly simple. But the problem came when the raccoon was being trained. So the raccoon could pick up the coin no problem. And at first, they were able to put the coin into the piggy bank. But as this behavior was being reinforced with food, the raccoon started to have trouble letting go of the coin. Eventually, they could coax the raccoon into dropping the coin into the piggy bank, but as they were trained more and more, the problem actually got worse. And when they went to the next stage of the trick, when they wanted the raccoon to pick up 2 coins to drop into the piggy bank, then everything went off the rails. The raccoon would just sit there and rub the 2 coins together and not let them go. And instead, what they were doing was actually illustrating what looked like food washing behavior. So the raccoon would sit there, rubbing the 2 coins together, dipping them into the piggy bank but not letting them go, and picking them back up and pulling them back out to rub together again. Now, because the raccoon was being reinforced with food, we started to see food preparation behaviors with the thing that was getting them the food, with the coins. They started treating the coins themselves like food. So this amusing situation actually illustrates the concept of instinctive drift. This is when an instrumental behavior that drifts to species-typical behavior dealing with some stimuli present in the environmental context. So the act of dropping the coins into the piggy bank ended up drifting to become more in line with food washing behaviors. So that instrumental behavior of picking up and dropping coins into a piggy bank came to line up with more of those food processing behaviors because they were receiving food as a reinforcer in this particular scenario. Now, this is a wall of text that basically says what I just said as a story, but this is the actual quote from the article when they were describing this happening. This block of text is also in the textbook, so if you've read that, you've already seen this, but I figured I'd put this in the slides in case you wanted to read this on your own to get more detail in case I missed something. Now, this idea of being reinforced with food, leading their behaviors to become biased towards food-involved behaviors, might make you think of, say, when we talked about our behavior systems earlier on in previous chapters. So we might say that being given a food reward, maybe that was activating the feeding system of the raccoons, and it was increasing the likelihood of feeding behaviors. So we can use that same concept of behavior systems and apply it to explain that odd scenario. And of course, once people start making this connection, there would be studies to follow up and see if this was actually the case. This is another of those very famous behavioral studies, and this is done by Shuttleworth back in '75. And this is another of my favorite studies just because it's really neat and it's something that I would never have thought to do. So very, very briefly, this experiment was done with hamsters. And so these hamsters were divided up into 6 different groups, and each group was reinforced for a different kind of behavior. So we had one group that was reinforced for scrabbling. Basically, they would sort of move dirt around using their paws. We'd have another group that would be reinforced for digging, so pretty self-explanatory. Another group for open rearing, and that's basically they would stand up on their back legs, which is a behavior that we'd often see hamsters do when they're looking for food. So all of these fall under our feeding system if we look at our behavioral systems. And then we had 3 others who were reinforced for behaviors that weren't necessarily linked to the feeding system. So things like washing their face, scratching, or marking their territory. And all 6 of these groups were actually reinforced using food, just like our raccoon was. So whenever they did the behavior that their group was being reinforced for, they would receive food. And so when we're looking at this graph here, so we have the mean amount of time during a particular trial that they would spend doing the behavior that they were being reinforced for. And at the beginning here, this MT section is actually just for magazine training. It's basically our baseline. So when they were being taught how to use the feeder in their operant box or wherever they were showing some that looks like triangles are digging, squares are open rearing, diamondy open shapes are washing their face, sort of a little bit of everything. So we were seeing a little bit of each of those. But this is just to show us that any of these behaviors are not much more common before training. And then we see that they all start with sort of lower levels of that reinforced behavior, but over time, our three behaviors that are related to feeding and getting food end up showing a dramatic increase in how often those behaviors are being that those behaviors are occurring. And the other behaviors, the ones not related to food getting or consuming of food, those don't show a dramatic increase. We do see a little bit of an increase, so they are kind of maybe learning that there's an association between doing that behavior and getting food. But what we see is this dramatic increase for all three of our food-related behaviors. And so our conclusion here is that belongingness might help facilitate learning. So these things being related to our feeding system and being reinforced with food makes these behaviors a lot easier to condition. And it's a lot harder to condition different behaviors that don't belong with the reinforcer, so things that don't go with our food reward. And so having this knowledge might help you pick an appropriate instrumental response when you're trying to figure out what kind of instrumental conditioning procedure you want to use. All right, so that was our instrumental responses. I'm actually going to hold off and do our outcome of response and our response reinforcer relationship in the next video. So we'll do 2 and 3 next time, and we'll cut it here for today.